Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, shalom, om swastiastu, namo buddhaya, salam kebajikan, salam pamuji rahayu. Ini mungkin saya menyapa dengan bahasa Indonesia dulu nggih, sebelum nanti kita masuk ke sesi yang lebih profesional dengan Prof. Byron dengan bahasa Inggris.
Recording in progress.
Oh nggih, saged. Terima kasih Ibu pencerahannya. Selamat siang kepada yang kami hormati, guru besar yang hadir melalui daring, Prof. Suwadi, kemudian Kepala Departemen kami, Dr. Carla Ermarsyra, kemudian Kaprodi kami, Dr. Roni Triwirasto, kemudian segenap staf yang hadir baik luring maupun daring, dan tidak ketinggalan our esteemed speaker in this afternoon session, Profesor Byron J. Goods. Thank you, Prof, for attending these sessions. Juga segenap Mbak dan Mas Residen Psychiatry ataupun yang lain yang saya banggakan, serta ada di sini senior kita, senior sekali Dr. Diola, silakan. Pada kesempatan ini kami akan Departemen Kedokteran Jiwa atau Psikiatri UGM akan menyelenggarakan kuliah tamu judulnya bertajuk Disaster Psychiatry Reflections on 10 Years of Work in Post-Conflict Aceh. Jadi Disaster Psychiatry ini adalah bagian dari rumpun ilmu kedokteran jiwa komunitas yang tentu saja kita mengetahui merupakan bagian yang tidak kalah pentingnya dalam perspektif-perspektif kedokteran jiwa lainnya. Sebelum kita lanjut kepada acara berikutnya, marilah kita dengarkan sambutan dari yang kami hormati, Kepala Program Studi Dr. Roni Triwirasto, Spesialis Kedokteran Jiwa. Pada Dr. Roni, waktu dan tempat kami silakan.
Sebenarnya saya sudah nyiapin sejak kemarin malam, tapi nggak jadi. Udah latihan juga pakai bahasa Inggris. Tapi saya lupa kalau Prof. Byron itu pandai berbahasa Indonesia. Sejak tahun 92 Prof. Byron sudah di Indonesia. Ya, Prof. Byron waktu itu, belum dibuka ya, lupa saya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Yang terhormat Prof. Byron, terima kasih sekali, senang sekali Prof. Byron di Jogja lagi. Tahun 2003-2004 saya belajar dengan Prof. Byron di Harvard Medical School. Dan pelajaran pertama yang saya dapatkan waktu itu adalah seminar tentang, sampai sekarang saya ingat, adalah suffering. Saya masih heran sampai sekarang kenapa suffering itu dipelajari dalam suatu seminar. Suffering, membicarakan suffering, ngapain loh suffering diomongin ya. Tapi ternyata setelah perjalanan waktu ternyata itu sangat penting sekali. Yang kedua, Bapak Ibu staf, Prof, dokter sekalian, ini berbahagia sekali. Siang ini kita mendapatkan kesempatan Prof. Byron untuk mengisi di Departemen Psikiatri, karena jarang-jarang dapat seahli beliau ini untuk memberikan kuliah kepada kita. Ya, kalau kita bicara psikiatri, semua profesor, semua yang terkenal di psikiatri seluruh dunia itu kalau bicara nanti kita bilang Prof. Byron pasti kenal semua. Semuanya itu, seluruh dunia itu. Mungkin itu yang bisa saya sampaikan. Semoga pertemuan kita kali ini bisa membawa manfaat untuk kita semua. Karena disaster psychiatry ini menjadi penting sekali. 2004 waktu itu Aceh ya, Prof. Byron ya. Luar biasa waktu itu program yang dibawa oleh beliau dan diberikan beliau pada kita semua. Mungkin tidak berpanjang kata, terima kasih sekali atas rawuhnya, kehadirannya. Mari kita dengarkan kuliah dari Prof. Byron. Terima kasih Prof. Byron.
Terima kasih Dr. Roni yang tadi sudah memberikan sambutannya. Dr. Roni mengingatkan kita kembali betapa pentingnya pembelajaran terkait ini dan juga kenangan Dr. Roni akan Prof. Byron terkait dengan kuliah mengenai suffering tadi. Oke, selanjutnya kita akan dengarkan sambutan dari Kepala Departemen Psikiatri UGM, Dr. Carla Ermarsyra. Waktu dan tempat kami persilahkan Dr. Carla.
minta maaf ya. Terima kasih ya Mas Fengnya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk semua. Tentu saja guest honor Prof. Byron, thank you so much for coming here and for giving us the lecture that's very important for us. Dan semuanya terima kasih sudah kersorawo. Juga bagi yang mendengarkan lewat Zoom, mungkin bapaknya Dr. Roni, Prof. Suwadi, dan juga yang lain-lain. Terima kasih sekali. Sebelumnya bukanlah minta maaf karena mungkin jarang kelihatan ya di depan kalian semua. Kesempatan ini membuat saya itu sangat-sangat berbahagia. Dan tentu saja di sini ada my academic father, Profesor Byron Good, yang bahkan sebelum kami berdua saling mengenal, beliau sudah menghadiri pernikahan saya tanpa beliau kenal siapa saya. Tentu saja itu namanya tamu tak diundang, betul ya Prof. Byron? Tapi suatu kehormatan bagi saya saat itu. Really Carla, are you get married on March 1996? Yes, it was me and Mas Sony. And I cannot believe it that you already attended my wedding before I really know you. Jadi saat itu saya benar-benar seperti semesta atau universe mempersatukan kita. Alhamdulillah. Untuk kesempatan kali ini kita merasa sangat terhormat. Beliau seperti kata Dr. Roni tadi, mungkin saking terkenalnya beliau, kalau nyebut Byron J. Good atau Mary Jo Good, istri Profesor Byron, itu semuanya tahu. Atau kalau tidak googling saja Wikipedia, ada di sana semua. Kalau nama saya yang di googling, nyangkutnya ke Prof. Byron. Bukan kok ke webnya, bukanlah tidak. Oh iya ini kenalannya Prof. Byron. Saking beliau ngetopnya seperti itu. Selanjutnya sekali lagi kita sangat beruntung karena beliau punya pengalaman luar biasa dalam hal disaster psychiatry. Dan kita berharap nanti semuanya bisa mendapatkan ilmu. Selamat datang juga tentu saja kepada para staf senior. Saya mohon maaf kalau ada yang terlewat. Jelas tadi saya melihat ada Dr. Mahar, Ibu Sumarni, Dewi. Kenapa sih Bu Dewi? Ya, Bu Mani langsung ketawa gitu ya. Ibu, ada yang belum saya sebut senior-senior yang belum rawuh secara onsite. Mungkin siapa sih?
Saya
sudah ya?
Permisi.
Masya Allah, Bu Mani rawuh di onsite lah. Oh dari Zoom, Masya Allah Ibu, tak cubit loh Ibu. Tadi saya bilang yang onsite. Kalau yang ya ini bunda saya tercinta soalnya kami kalau tiap pagi sapa-sapaan kirim stiker yang lucu-lucu. Selamat siang ibuku sayang, ibundaku sayang. Terima kasih saudara rawuh. Moga-moga nanti apa yang kita bicarakan di sini yang diberikan oleh Pak Byron bisa bermanfaat bagi kita semua. Amin, amin, ya rabbal alamin. Selanjutnya silakan mendengarkan dan kita semua pasti akan berdoa bahwa apa yang diberikan Prof. Byron menjadikan manfaat yang tiada tara. Amin, amin, ya rabbal alamin. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Terima kasih Dokter atas sambutannya. Kita tepuk tangan dulu. Oke, setelah kita mendengarkan sambutan-sambutan dari Dr. Roni dan juga Dr. Carla, maka kita akan masuk ke inti acara pada kesempatan siang hari ini. Untuk itu, perkenalkan saya mengundang narasumber kita, our esteemed speaker, Profesor Byron J. Good, PhD. Kepada Prof. Byron, monggo Prof.
Silakan.
Profesor Byron, wah ini orek-oreknya kok kecil sekali, jadi saya agak sulit gini untuk membacanya, tapi izinkan saya membacanya di sini. Jadi So, Prof. Byron, first things first, let me read about your curriculum vitae, Prof. Byron J. Good. Oke. Nge. Profesor Byron merupakan seorang doktor di bidang sosial antropologi. Jabatan akademik saat ini adalah Profesor Antropologi Medis di Harvard Medical School since 1992. Visiting Profesor di UGM sejak 2017 dan merupakan ketua departemen dari kedokteran sosial di Harvard Medical School. Beliau juga sudah mendapatkan berbagai penghargaan dari Louis Henry Morgan Lectures, Lifetime Mentoring Award, dan Lifetime Achievement Award. Ini dari, kalau yang Mentoring Award dari Society for Medical Anthropology, dan juga Lifetime Achievement Award dari Society for Psychological Anthropology. Jadi memang bidang keilmuan beliau, kepakarannya adalah antropologi medis khususnya barangkali. Kemudian fokus keahliannya adalah antropologi medis, psikologi, dan psikiatri, kajian kesehatan mental di negara berkembang, terutama di Indonesia, trauma akibat konflik dan bencana seperti di Aceh, dan juga layanan kesehatan mental dengan wilayah yang memiliki sumber dayanya terbatas. Dan hingga saat ini beliau adalah dosen tamu dan juga kolaborator riset di Departemen Psikiatri dan juga Fakultas Psikologi UGM. Beliau sudah menuliskan lebih dari 13 buku dan lebih dari 140 artikel ilmiah. Kita dua referat aja mengkis-mengkis nih. Buku yang tenar dari beliau adalah Culture and Depression, Medicine, Rationality and Experience, Culture and PTSD, serta buku yang senang sekali saya baca, Jiwa Sehat Negara Kuat. Kalau mau dicari silahkan ada di Tokopedia atau di Gramedia terdekat. Nggih? Oke, mungkin itu kurikulum vitae yang saya bacakan dari Prof. Byron. Sekarang izinkan saya untuk lenggah, karena tadi saya berdiri posisinya MC, sekarang saya jadi moderator, saya boleh lenggah berarti. Oke. Prof. Byron, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you. Terima kasih banyak. So, terima kasih banyak untuk ya kesempatan untuk ikut di sini lagi sebagai yang kasih lecture ini tentang yang disaster psychiatry. Bu Dr. Pauline bilang lama dia mau Pak Biden datang, tapi saya bilang lebih baik kalau saya tidak lewat Zoom, saya lebih suka kalau betul-betul di sini bisa bersama dengan teman-teman yang lama-lama di sini. Dan saya mohon maaf, saya dulu waktu tahun 96 baru mulai datang ke sini, sering sama di psikiatri, sekarang agak kurang. Ya sering ada di situ, tapi masih ada teman-teman saya dari lama-lama yang ada di sini. So saya yang semuanya yang Pak Mahar, ada Bu Carla, ada Bu Marni dari dan Bu Diola yang kerja sama dengan beberapa proyek sama yang tim kami, dan mohon maaf Bu Mary Jo nggak bisa ikut hari ini karena dia sekarang di Turki. Pergi ke situ untuk 3 minggu karena 60 tahun yang lalu dia volunteer Peace Corps di Turki untuk 2 tahun. Dan sekarang dia kembali itu untuk seperti dikit nostalgia tour itu. Untuk hari ini saya ya campur-campur bahasa Inggris, bahasa Indonesia itu. Saya kira untuk yang agak lebih formal, mungkin seharusnya bahasa Inggris, dan mungkin semuanya di sini bahasa Inggris lebih baik daripada yang bahasa Indonesia yang saya itu. So I want to begin by just reminding you a few obvious things about responding to disaster. There are stages, so in the beginning there is always a kind of initial emergency response. And for that period of time, disaster psychiatry is very important to deal with the most urgent crises. Sometimes, for instance, it's impossible for people to find medications after this. So very practical activities. Sometimes the RSJ are closed down so that, for instance, when the tsunami hit, many of the psychiatric units were all closed down. People had to leave. And it's important in the very early stages to return people, to find housing, to help people return to schools, establish life routines. Then there is an intermediate response, which is to provide care linked to common mental health problems related to trauma. So for instance, we'll say more about this, but in the immediate period after a disaster, there is an immediate rise in depression, anxiety, depending on the kind of disaster, in PTSD, and very often there is an opportunity because of money coming in for disaster care to build new models of mental health services. And then the question of, is the long term, is whether there remains after. So I remember when I started working with IOM after the tsunami, and I'll tell you about this, but the director of IOM in Jakarta, he said, you know, with the tsunami, the money will also come like a tsunami. At first, a big lot of money will come in, and then very soon it will also go away. And the question is, can you build services that also have long-term commitment? So that's a kind of background for any kind of disaster and a role of psychiatry in that setting. Now, is this big enough to see? I think it's important just to remind us that, if you look at before disaster and after disaster, there is a small rise in number of psychoses, but for more common mental health problems, there's a doubling, often 2 times greater number of common mental illnesses, depression in particular, depression, anxiety disorders. And you can see here mild or moderate mental disorders, and then moderate or severe psychological distress. May be as much as 30 to 50% of the population. So it's just a reminder that there is a great deal of increase in mental health problems that are associated with disaster. And I always use, especially when I'm talking to people about implementation studies. So implementation research means that you actually try to identify a problem, you try to find a way to solve it, and then you measure whether you've found a way to solve the problem. So when in the whole area now of intervention work, there's a whole field that has developed of intervention studies, of what they call often implementation science. Implementation science means we know how to solve a problem, but can we actually implement it? It's very easy, much easier to get a policy made in Jakarta than to actually deliver it in Gunung Kidul, right? The question is, how can you have policies that actually get implemented? And I often use this kind of model in talking about that. That first of all, you have to be clear what kind of problem you want to intervene in. And you do a kind of baseline assessment. That secondly, you have to know what the situation is. And thirdly, then you need to develop a pilot model of intervention, do it, evaluate it, improve it, and then begin to extend the evaluation to larger groups of population, and then do more formal analysis, formal evaluation, and then use the data from that for advocacy and for improving routinely, for involving for quality improvement. And I know that whether it was with Diola or with others, with Bukarla, when we worked on projects funded with USAID before we had a crazy president who cut out USAID, well, that we did a series of identification of problems, of simple problems. Seems simple, right? How, when someone leaves RSJ in Pakam, how do you actually communicate directly with their puskesmas? What is the responsibility for the RSJ Pakam before they leave? What kind of planning is there? And then how do you communicate with the puskesmas? And I remember the puskesmas Pakam is about berapa itu 100 meter antara yang RSJ dan puskesmas itu. And they said, it's easy. We send a letter. They sent a letter from RSJ to puskesmas 2 bulan untuk 100 meter itu. Wah, itu nggak bisa. And so they began a whole process of how do you actually best communicate? Can you do it by, what kinds of means? So all I'm saying is that each of these kinds of things you develop, you make trial, and then you try to improve. And so that's the kind of model I'm going to take you through for talking about also responding to disaster. So let me just ask one question. How many of you actually remember clearly the tsunami in Aceh? Berapa orang masih ingat itu? Berapa orang yang betul-betul tidak ingat itu? Ini sudah 20 tahun yang lalu. Berapa orang yang dengar tapi tidak bisa betul-betul ingat waktu itu? Yang orang di sini, berapa orang yang kurang dari 30 tahun umur? Berapa? Hampir, ya. Banyak, ya. Dan banyak yang hampir tidak ingat, betul? Kemarin, 2 tahun yang lalu saya kembali ke Aceh. Dan saya masih ingat waktu saya pergi jalan-jalan di utara Banda Aceh itu ada yang basis untuk TNI yang besar-besar di pusat Banda Aceh, dan saya ada rasanya, wah ini hampir sama dengan waktunya ada yang konflik di situ. Mereka masih kuat sekali di situ. Dan hari itu saya bicara sama teman-teman di Unsia. Ada yang staff di situ 25 tahun umurnya. Dan saya bilang waktu itu, waktu saya hari ini yang jalan-jalan di sini, saya seperti dihantui oleh apa yang terjadi 20 tahun yang lalu. Karena saya masih ingat yang militer keras sekali. Dan mereka kerjasama dengan Polri. Keras sekali mereka semuanya takut dari itu. Dan mereka masih ada di sini. Dan yang staff di situ bilang, wah, saya tidak pernah pikir tentang itu. Kalau saya lihat yang Polri atau polisi, saya pikir, oh, ada helm atau tidak? Itu aja. Saya nggak pernah pikir ini yang orang yang bahaya. Itu. Tadi malam itu, malam sama itu saya pergi untuk resto bersama dengan yang Grab driver siapa itu, dan saya tanya dari sopir, Bapak masih ingat waktunya ada tsunami di sini dan Bapak ya ada apa di situ? Dia sepi sekali. Kemudian dia bilang, ibu saya tidak pernah diketemu. They never found my mother. Dan 27 orang dari keluarga saya yang korban yang hilang. 27 members of my family disappeared. These two generations live beside each other. Ada satu generasi yang masih trauma sampai hari ini. Ada generasi yang baru yang tidak ingat waktunya itu, seperti banyak di sini saya kira tidak betul-betul ingat yang 20 tahun yang lalu karena masih anak waktu itu, betul? Itu. So that's a kind of background for how things change over time. But I want to take you back and talk about our work in Aceh. Just the overview, as I said, the tsunami was in December 26, 2004. More than 200 humanitarian organizations came in, and only then did many people realize that there was a conflict. Banyak orang dari luar negeri nggak tahu tentang yang konflik antara GAM dan ya gerakan Aceh Merdeka itu bersama dengan TNI. Apa itu mereka nggak tahu, tapi waktu mereka masuk untuk yang tsunami, mereka baru betul mengerti itu. And there was terrible violence, I'll talk about this, against the civilians. So, and then Helsinki Peace Agreement, 15 Agustus 2005 ada itu. Kemudian, after that, new post-conflict humanitarian intervention. And I will just say that our main involvement was in the post-conflict work rather than the post-tsunami work. This is a reminder. Is there a pointer here? Tahu di mana? Gak tahu yang mana pointer. Di mana? Okay. So just to remind you where, there you see Medan, and that's Aceh is just on that point and looks like this. So our work was in the first part of our work, we were invited by IOM, International Organization for Migration, to work in Pidi, in Birun, and in Aceh Utara. And only later, and that was because that was really the highest area of the conflict. Whereas the highest area for the tsunami was on the southwest coast, in Malabo, Aceh Barat Daya, Aceh Selatan, Aceh Jaya. So a reminder, the big earthquake lasted for more than 10 minutes. Waves were more than 30 meters high, 3 waves, and somewhere between 168 and 180,000 people in 15 minutes were killed. The whole coastline was destroyed, so it looked like this, immediately following. Like this. This is what people came to have to find bodies here. And people who survived were looking for their relatives, and no one knew where they were. So there was a big effort to find such as this. So, yeah, so the names of people, sama, ya kalau mereka yang cari ya ada. If you have any information, please contact us. But this just gives you a picture of the period immediately following the tsunami, and then they set up immediately barracks, barak untuk yang orang yang kehilangan rumah itu. kadang-kadang yang jelek seperti ini juga tempatnya itu. But people became aware of the conflict. And Aceh has a long history of conflict with the central government, but it of course goes back to the Dutch period. In the colonial period, the Acehnese were the strongest fighters against the Dutch. And you know the history of the great women sultans and the great fighters for freedom came, many of them from Aceh. In 1980s, there was gas discovered off the coast of Lok Samawe. And immediately the gas wells were huge amount of money, huge amount of gas came, so that in the early 1990s, 25% of the world global profit of ExxonMobil, 25% of their profit came from Lok Samawe. And 10% of the budget of Jakarta, of the national budget, came from Lok Samawe, and none of the money went back to Lok Samawe. Aceh remained the 22nd or 23rd poorest province of all of Indonesia. And so people began complaining and then tried to stop the production of oil for short periods of time. Given the amount of money, ExxonMobil didn't want to shut down the oil, and also neither did the central government, so they sent in TNI bersama dengan yang polisi dan lain untuk yang bisa protection of the oil wells. Very quickly, because Acehnese are very good fighters, they quickly began to take weapons to many times lewat korupsi. Mereka bisa beli military equipment, alat militer langsung dari TNI juga. I remember one of the military leaders from Aceh, from GAM, he told me, it was easier for us up in the hills to get weapons than it was to get Coca-Cola, because they would buy it often from TNI directly. And it led to a lot of violence. And increasingly over a period of time, by the at the end of the Suharto era, which I know many of you don't remember, but for those of us who lived here, we remember very well. At that time, there was a lot of conflict. There was hope that with Gustur, with Bumega, perhaps the conflict would end, but instead it often got much, much worse. And during the period that Mega was president, and even though there was reformasi, there was still big conflict. And it was at a time when Timor became Timor-Leste, and orang Aceh mau sama itu. Many people did. And so that it intensified the conflict. After the tsunami, during the tsunami, the military TNI bases were many of them right along the coast. Lebih dari 25,000 orang dari TNI yang meninggal dalam tsunami juga. So banyak ada korban, banyak dari TNI, ada banyak dari orang Aceh juga. And it really led to the peace process being successful and being signed only 7 months after the tsunami. And so that was the time that IOM asked Mary Jo and me from Harvard to consult with them about developing mental health projects, not focused mostly on tsunami, but up in the hills. So the tsunami, hit the coast, but the conflict was up in the hills, up in the middle of Aceh. And this gives you a sense of what the low area before you start climbing up into the hills of Aceh looks like. And as you began driving up, you would see this. Buildings that were burned, that had been burned primarily by the TNI, that had been, schools were burned out, hospitals were burned, buildings were torn down, people's houses were burned. So the head of IOM asked us, would we help them develop a mental health response? And they said, we think the most important thing to begin with is to do a psychosocial needs assessment. So if we had time here, if we had really time for a smaller group discussion about this, I would ask you, what's a psychosocial needs assessment? API do? What methods would you use? What kind of sample? What would you want to measure if you're measuring mental health needs? How would you use quantitative, qualitative research together? What kind of mixed methods research would you do? Then how would you present your findings? And that's how we began actually doing our work there. And I would just say from the very beginning, we were committed to the idea that anything that we found would actually be used to improve health services there. So we began working. I had my PhD student, Jesse Grayman, had begun working with IOM. We introduced him, and he was working with a team. And we decided that we would lead first a psychosocial needs assessment up in the hills in PD and Birun and Aceh Utara. So we had to develop questionnaires. We have to think, kalau ada banyak orang yang agak tua bicara bahasa Aceh aja, bagaimana itu? So how do we actually work back and forth between bahasa Aceh, bahasa Indonesia? What kinds of questionnaires do we develop? How do we do qualitative interviews? So we made the decision to do a sampling, a real random sampling of villages in high conflict area first, and then we would go into the village and do a sampling of the adults in the village, and then we would go to a household of the households, then go to a household and sample individuals, so that we would actually have a random sample of individuals in high conflict area. And this is, you can see Jesse Grayman in this picture here, but this is a munasa in Aceh. Ada orang Aceh di sini? Ada ini? Siapa? Masih ingat waktu itu? But does this look familiar to you? Yeah, itu, betul. And so we had then teams that would go into each village. This was in an area later in Aceh Selatan where it was very hard to get to. And in the village, they would first go, and together they would select randomly from the list of all households, select households. Then to do because we were giving, kalau saya ingat itu 10,000 untuk wawancara dengan yang orang untuk for qualitative interviews harus pilih beberapa orang. Wah, mereka yang marah kalau uang dikasih 10.000 atau 20.000 dikasih kepada satu orang tidak ada mengapa enggak wawancari yang saya itu. So we chose randomly names of people in this way. And we heard stories, and I will tell you of very few, but we heard terrible stories about what was happening up in the area during the conflict. So these were we agreed in December of 2005 to do a psychosocial needs assessment. We developed the questionnaire and trained people in 1 month in January. And by February, we already began putting data into the computer and began to have results. This is what we later talked about working by having to follow the schedule of like humanitarian organizations which want to get things done fast. So you don't have 2 years to plan a research project. You have to do it immediately. And we found this. Up in these hills, 78% of people had lived through firefights and bombing. 38% of the adults had at some time had to flee from burning buildings. 47% had to flee at some time from. 54% witnessed serious physical conflict, physical injury. And then I still remember the first time because we heard terrible stories about orang yang bilang yang waktunya suaminya yang meninggal, ada anak saya pagi keluar rumah saya, di depan itu ada anak saya yang udah meninggal. Itu pertama kali saya keluar rumah saya, ada di situ. But I still thought, oh, maybe we heard just the bad places. No. I still remember when it came out, 8% of women had their husband killed. 5% of the total sample had a child who was killed. And 33% had a family member or a friend who was kidnapped or disappeared. So the first findings were that by just having a list of traumatic events and asking, did you ever experience this? These are the things we found. And then we decided not to do diagnostic interviews, but symptom checklists. And what we found were extraordinarily high levels of anxiety, depression, and PTSD. This again says now, if you look at, you don't have to read all this. You'll get access. Any of you who really want to follow up, we can also give you access to the things that we publish from this. See you. But there were differences, of course, between men and women. There's also differences by Piti Biren and Aceh Utara. So for instance, you can see, if you look at Biren, that, look at at the differences, for instance. So, have you ever been tortured? Bapak Ibu pernah disiksa. And the figures are 25% of men reported they had been tortured. 11% of women, so it wasn't rare among women either. And it varied because in PD it was 7%, whereas in Biren Aceh Utara it was like 25%. So it gives you a sense of how you begin having to map out who are really Now, from this, I won't try to go through this, but we tried to figure out how can we identify, like, who are really the high level, who has the most, I mean, how much is this like symptoms, how much of this is psychiatric disorder, and what cutoff point? If you have a standard, if you have a symptom checklist, how do you say who is high and who is low? And I would just say that this was the mean depression score of 1.75 on a 5-point scale, going from not at all, was used internationally for a cutoff. And if you use that, then 65% of people were depressed. But if you used a different cutoff, like greater than 3, on a 4-point scale it was, then it's 17%. But what if you compared these data with studies any place in the world, Aceh had some of the highest rates of psychiatric symptoms. And this was already being done 6 months after the peace agreement. So I would just begin by saying that any intervention, that a peace agreement is the most important intervention, period. That stopping the war was the most important intervention for mental health. And then after that, I'll talk with you about what we chose to do. But this gives you a sense that there were also high levels of PTSD, but not as high as of depression and of general anxiety disorders. And this is just an odds analysis that says, for instance, if you look at this, if you met criteria for a high level of PTSD, if you had more than 10 events, if you said yes on 10 of those events, you were 40 times more likely than the average to have a very high level of PTSD, for instance. And so that there's a direct relationship between the number of events, 0 to 3, 4 to 7, 8 to 10, or 11 or higher. A direct odds, increases your odds of having mental health problems if you have an increased number of traumatic events. This was always, I remember when we spoke in Aceh and told people these stories, people would stop suddenly talking in the audience and listen carefully to this, because we said this was done in Biren with men and with women, and we asked them about head trauma. Because many people were beaten, on the head. Many actually suffered brain damage from suffocation. One of the ways of getting information from people was to put their heads underwater, keep them underwater until they could come up, and then ask them again, where is GAM? Which members of your family are supporting GAM, etc. And if you look at men between ages 17 and 29, 68% of young men in these villages suffered head trauma. 68%. 60% of young men ages 17 to 29 were beaten on the head. 29% were suffocated. 17% near drowning. And so this was like both. So this was also neuropsychiatric difficulties as well as traumatic experience. So, situation analysis. There was very high morbidity of mental health problems in the high conflict areas. In Aceh at that time had 2 full-time psychiatrists, 2 part-time psychiatrists for 4 million people. spread out about, in an area larger than DIE. Yeah, there were puskesmas in each sub-district, and WHO and Menkes Jakarta had begun training community mental health nurses. I'll come back and talk about this, but they were very proud of doing it, but they decided that as creating what they called the Aceh model, which would have training of JMHN, community mental health nurses, that they would begin by focusing on severe mental, that is on psychosis. But of course, that's not really related to the biggest problems that were facing the population at that time. And the villages were isolated, and many times villagers would not go to puskesmas if they were, number one, because often there was basis militaire right beside the puskesmas, so they could watch. If anyone comes in with an injury, they would interrogate them. So no one was going to actually go and talk about that they had been tortured in the puskesmas at that time. And also, we know people in general think puskesmas nggak pergi ke situ untuk problem jiwa itu, untuk yang perempuan anak itu. So then the question is, how would you respond? What would you do? And the first thing is, we were committed that we would try to encourage IOM to invest. We just felt people told us terrible stories. We are not going to just go home and publish the data. No. IOM now has a commitment that they have to provide mental health services to these same communities. In 2006, during this, I remember it was up in a village in Aceh Utara. The students who did interviews for us said, please, please, there's this one village that was so damaged. You have to go and send a team to help people there. It was a place that when you got there, there was not one chicken in the village. There was not one goat in the village. There was not one cow in the village. And you know, that's impossible. But everything was taken from that village, and everyone had been beaten. And so we went with a GOM person and with IOM in a large truck up to this village, and this was where we were sitting outside chatting with people at the coffee house before we went walking over to the Manasa. And this is the first person they brought and said, here is an example of what they did. And this man had suffered. His story was that the military, that a group from TNE had come, had questioned him. They said he was hung like a goat. That is, his feet were tied, his hands were tied, he was hung on a pole, his head was beaten, and then they put a plastic bag over his head and expected him to die. The villagers found him and took the bag off, but he had already suffered anoxia, he had already suffered brain damage. And until now, he is still, as people said, he cries easily, he can't work, he can't do anything. So clearly he had very severe head trauma associated with this. And he was the first person. They said, see, this is what they did. And so this is our psychiatrist who worked for IOM. He was himself from Aceh. And he first grabbed the man's hand, said a prayer with him. And then gave him an injection to quiet him of, I assume, of a sedative, and who soon he was sleeping. And then he sat, and in this, so this is now like a trauma clinic, but a very public trauma clinic. And you think often, oh, these stories are private. You can only have private stories. But everyone knew the stories. There were no secrets in that village. Everyone knew who had been raped. Everyone knew whose husband had been killed, whose son had been killed. And one by one, they came and told their story to Ibrahim. He would then give them a small amount of medication of some kind, and then refer them to the Puskas. And so we sat for about 5 or 6 hours listening to stories in that village until he was very tired, and he had the massage guy who did massage for soccer players massage him before we stopped and went home. So what did we learn from that one experience? Number one, that if you have a clinic, people will come. If you say that you're having a clinic for trauma, because by then that word was very common in Aceh. If you have a clinic for trauma, people will come. They want medications. And he also then referred them for continuing care to Puskesmas, but we knew they wouldn't go. And we also knew that the Puskesmas didn't have medications often. So from this, we tried to decide, okay, what kind of program can we actually build? And so the determination was, you can't build a program using psychiatrists, right? Because there are 2 for all of Aceh and 2 part-time. So you have to train GPs and nurses to provide mental health care. Secondly, you have to go to the village. You can't wait for villagers to come to you. So we made teams that went into the villages to do case finding, enter patients into sustained treatment, using basically a kind of medical model of doing a diagnosis and giving medications. And then also going back, making sure that you would go back at least in the first period. They went for like once a week for 1 month, and then once a month after that, as they brought people into treatment. And then after 8 months, when the funding for this was over, people could began transitioning people into the primary care system, into Puskesmas. And the decision in this first model was to only use medications that were available, only use the anxiety and antidepressant medications that were available in the Puskesmas, which meant at that time no SSRIs at all, for instance, were used, which meant that the antidepressants were mostly the kind of drugs that you would use much less today because they make people so sleepy that but it had a very important effect, which is that, and I can talk more about this, but one of the major ways of the effectiveness was that people were able to sleep. We heard stories of people who would tell us a story of something terrible that had happened when they were forced to watch their husband killed in front of them. And they were told the story. This was in February, after the peace agreement in August. This was 7 months later. they still told the story. And this is this is actually a year later, right? Because we then developed the intervention program a year later. So this is more than a year and a half after the conflict ended. And people would tell us a story like it happened yesterday. And they said, I can't sleep at night because every night after 1 or 2 hours, ada mimpi buruk, but it's what it really was, is they re-experienced the trauma in their dreams, and they would wake up terrified and not be able to sleep. And I remember a case in which someone was telling us this, and I thought, maybe this was some unusual case. It happened like a month ago. No, it happened 10 years ago. The person had not slept for 10 years, essentially. And they would use, of course, the word, if you would ask about memories of what happened, they would not use the word mengingat, they would use the word teringat. That is, these memories that come to you. You don't want to remember. You aren't trying to remember, you're trying to forget. Tapi yang teringat, they come into you. So that was the first phase of our work. We treated 582 patients in 25 villages with support from the Norwegian government, did a kind of soft evaluation of it. Is it working? And I would just say, at the same time, as I mentioned, the Ministry of Health from Jakarta had been collaborating with Dinkes Provinsi to develop the community mental health nurse training program of training 4 or 5 existing nurses in each puskesmas. And we ourselves work closely with them, that is, and then they also trained specialist kader desa Keswa for each village at that time. That was done by Jakarta, but they, as I said, they focused largely at that time on psychosis, and I'll show you why that's a problem. But we ourselves worked very close with Dinkes Biren, Dinkes Aceh Utara, and with the Puskesmas and with the CMHN, JMHN, Young Adadi in each Puskesmas, as well as with the kader desa. So when we would go to a village, when our teams would go to a village, when the IOM teams would go to a village, they would first go to Puskesmas. They would then move on and work in, then go to the village, then connect with the kader desa there. And so that was the model that was worked out. And we always work closely with the kabupaten. And there's always conflict in every place I've ever been between Dinkes Kabupaten and Dinkes Provinsi, because Provinsi feels they don't have enough control, especially when during that time, people felt like the provincial government felt they had no control over all of these different interventions that were going on. So this is a kind of model of going into the village, also having village meetings along with treating people. All right, I'm going to go through this part. I have 10 minutes. I'm going to go through this. We then extended this to another 50 villages, and this time we did a real outcome study. And I could ask you, how do you do an outcome study? How do you do this kind of work? We'd be happy to talk another time about that. But this is just to say, we first did interviews with each person who had a mental health problem at time 1, when they entered into treatment. Time 2 was about 8 months later, and then time 3 was an 18-month follow-up. And one of the amazing things here is that there were between And of this, you can see the number went from 1,122. Only 5% people got lost to follow-up in 18 months, which is really quite unusual. And then you can see, this looks like a Puskesmas actual sample. Twice as many women as men, even though men had more trauma, right? That's always true in Puskesmas. But that is, if you have primary mental health care, it will also look like primary care. And you can see the ages. Younger people, even though despite how much of the trauma they suffered, are not the people who are most likely to go into care. But this, I think, is important just to look at, that 6% of people actually met diagnostic criteria for depression, 42% for anxiety, for GAD, general anxiety, to mixed depression, anxiety, another 16%, PTSD, 32%, somatoform and insomnia, 14%, organic disorders, 1%, and psychotic disorders, 2% of the sample. What that says is, if you only focus on psychosis, you miss 97% of the cases of people who need to be treated in this kind of a situation. We're now talking about almost 2 years after the tsunami, after the peace agreement. I won't go through. Let me just say about this. All this is saying is that compared with the baseline of 39%, the people we found at time 1 of the interviews had very high levels of symptoms, and by time 1, time 2, time 3, the symptoms went down. And that also you see here, that over time. So what it's saying is, we were working in a time when many of the NGOs who were working there, if you asked them for an evaluation, they would report on how many people they treated. They would never report on whether people got better. And we were committed to saying, yeah, we treated people, but did they get better? And so this is like a 18-month follow-up study. And of these people you see, only 3% were given antipsychotic medications. 49% were given antidepressants, another 49% anti-anxiety medications. And most of the people, if you look down below, so 11% only took medications for 1 month, 1 to 3 months, 29, 3 to 6 months. That is to say that this treatment was often not long-term medication. This was actually quite brief medication. You can ask, what was the effectiveness of this? And then we asked people, after 18 months, from the time you began treatment until now, have your symptoms got much worse, somewhat worse, a little worse, the same, a little better, much better? 83% of people got better over the 18 months of treatment. And if you ask them about being able to work, 67% increased their ability to work. And to me, this is one of the most powerful slides of the whole thing. When they entered into treatment, we asked them, before you were sick with your mental health problems, how many hours could you work? That was in the middle of the conflict. And they said 28 hours. At the time you got sick, how many hours could you work? It went down to 10 hours a week. At time 3, we asked people, now how many hours are you working? Went up to over 40 hours. So that there are incredible benefits in all kinds of ways of mental health treatment. This is just to say, families also had to take care of people during the time and before treatment and after treatment, like the number who needed to be taken to the hospital, taken off to care was reduced. We also did a livelihood intervention for some part, for like 10% of the villages, and of giving them money, and because often IOM had in two completely separate things, psychosocial intervention, yep, I'll finish in just a minute, and mental health interventions completely separate. And we said, well, this means, which do you think you would rather have? Treatment for mental health, medication, mental health medication, and no job, or medication and a job? And if you help people regain their jobs, guess what? They also got better. And this just shows that a larger number of people got better who were also given the combination of livelihood. And they were also able to return to work more. So the conclusion of this part of the study was really that mental health problems remain a long time after a conflict. And they have powerful economic and social effects. And they're treatable, and people get better. The treatments will have economic benefits as well as mental health benefits. And that implementation research is critical to supporting the work, to actually showing how the outcomes work. Now, this is just the last, this is the really last slide. 20 years later, we go, what's left of this, of all of these programs? The first thing is astonishing. At the time we went, there were 2 psychiatrists in Banda Aceh and 2 psychiatrists who would come part-time from Medan. There are now more than 40 psychiatrists in Aceh. Some of them are you-trained, Bu Carla, right? Some of them have gone back from this program. Others were trained in UI, etc. Now, almost every RSUD now has the district hospital have a psychiatrist and a clinic. However, since 2005, they have trained not one new JMHN. So the nursing program is still active, but you know, ada rotasi, ada orang yang sudah pindah, atau mungkin sudah pensiun. And so by now, there are very few of the CMHN left. And what has really happened is what was the model for Indonesia of community mental health nursing was, for community mental health programs, has once again become mostly a hospital-based system. And most of the real community care is slowly going away. I also want to just acknowledge, since Pak Mahar is here and Hanin is here, that Ninik was in that project with us and spent time out. We spent a lot of time in Aceh along with Bu Ninik at the same time. And she was terrific. And one of the last times I saw her was when I was talking her memories about when she was in Aceh. So these were how old these kids were. This is how old many of you were when the tsunami happened. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Byron, for the presentation. Okay. From what I can conclude from this presentation is, first, Aceh has a unique position in this discussion, plays a unique position in this discussion. First, Aceh needs to recover from separatist movement, also recovery from the tsunami in 2004. And then for recovery, Aceh received lots of humanitarian aid supposed to develop Aceh further. Also, we have to put on certain consideration about what's inside the mind of the people of Aceh. Also, there are many factors that can corroborate with the mental health conditions of people of Aceh. Also, based upon this situation, now we discuss about the development of mental health services as part of the post-conflict responses, be it the conflict from the central government with the separatist movement, also from when Aceh is recovering from the 2004 tsunami. Okay, for the discussion, this is the interesting part. Also, from the latest two slides of your presentation, yeah, Professor Byron, it is stated that currently the community mental health approach in Aceh slowly turned into the hospital-based approach rather than utilizing the community, especially the also there are no trained community mental health nurses or maybe other healthcare professionals. Given the shift from the community-based mental health services to hospital-based care in post-conflict Aceh, what strategies could be implemented to sustain and strengthen community mental health programs, especially in areas with limited psychiatric resources? Professor.
So, I mean, we know several things are happening right now at the national level. And we don't really know what is going to happen. But we know that the issue of really developing mental health care in Puskesmas is very hard. It is now one of the required SPM, right? That each Puskesmas, that each district should be responsible for providing care to the persons with psychosis. And we know how difficult that is. And we know partly because the hospitals and the Puskesmas are in completely separate units of Menkes, right? One is under one is under public health with all Puskesmas. One is under so that the collaboration. You add into this, there is another ministry, Dinsos, who anytime you use the word rehab, you have to include working with Dinsos. We also know that there is a fourth ministry that is involved so that Karadesa are in Menteri Dalam, right? They are not really controlled by Menkes. So we begin with a system, and then this is something that Irman Shah told me a couple of weeks ago, Bukarla. He said that there are 10 times more beds for people with psychosis in Pesantren than in RSJ. And now there is a new policy that says every RSJ should become a general hospital and that they should reduce psychiatric beds by 30 to 50% in a country that has already maybe 25% of the number of psychiatric beds that are needed. So this is the current reality of trying to ask, so what can we do? And the other thing there is a commitment from Pak Budi Gunayan, right? Yeah, betul. He is committed to primary care and has begun at least the possibility for psychologists working in Puskesmas, and we have no idea what they're going to do. But what I would say is that the model of training CMHN was very, very important and was quite successful. And they had to also have money for them to actually go into the village. And that was a very successful program. And it was not funded after the humanitarian organizations left. And I would say, the question is, how can we have, if you want to ask, how should CMHN be trained? How should Puskesmas doctors be trained? What kind of collaboration? I know at one point Carla was sending the residents actually into Puskesmas for some period of training and of building links. So there's a lot to be done, but if there is to be a real community mental health program, there has to be a new commitment to mental health, both through the training of nurses. We know that there are a few places like Kasiandua in Jogja that have very powerful nurses that lead the move for mental health care. But it's very, very, that's not usually true. And so the question of how to really invest more money and training in Puskesmas for mental health remains, I think, a very big question. It requires a real commitment. And I just feel that the current demand to reduce costs, every place in the world, certainly in the United States, every place in the world, a demand to reduce costs of government, often take mental health care is the first to be asked to reduce costs.
Right, thank you for the answer, Prof. Baran. So what we can conclude here that one of the most fundamental problem here are organizational problems also and system. And to develop the community mental health program, we also need resource and commitment on how we can deliver the community mental health approach towards to answer this current situation of mental health problems. Moreover, in larger perspective in Indonesia in general. Okay, before
I'm just going to add one thing to even the difficulties.
Okay.
Because the BPJS now is also reducing the time people are able to stay in the hospital. And I personally have visited with Bu Nuning, have gone and visited persons, a family, a brother who has his younger sister, but who's old, they're both fairly old, is in really terrible condition in Pasung, not just locked in a room, very psychotic, receiving no medication. And he said, you know, when she could stay there for 2 or 3 months, she would get better, and then she could be good for quite a long time. But now, so my big fear is that the cutting of hospital beds and the reducing of the number of days people can stay in the hospital, where will people go? Pasung, where will they go? They will also go to the pesantren, which often are also forms of pasung juga. So that's where, this is like why I feel right now there is kind of a real potential for a crisis. At the same time, there's potential, you know, for real improvement, but there's a potential for a real crisis in mental health right now.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Baran, for emphasizing the importance of these problems, also which can lead into more numbers of pasung and other unorthodox approach for this matter. Okay, before we move on to discussion with our residents and also staff here, now we would like to hear a question from Professor Swadi. Sugeng siang, Profesor. Nuhun sewu, Prof. Niki lajeng
Halo, Profesor
hendak
Byron.
bertanya langsung kepada Prof. Byron. Barangkali bisa
Do you
dibantu
hear me,
untuk
Profesor
Prof.
Byron?
bisa berdiskusi langsung dengan
Halo,
Prof.
Profesor
Byron yang
Byron.
hadir melalui daring, nggih, Prof.
Halo, Profesor Byron.
Hello,
Do you hear
Prof.
me?
Hello, Prof. Hello, Prof. I can hear you fine.
Okay. Thanks for coming to our department. Okay. I will ask because I am a psychiatrist and interest to community psychiatry. So, would you please a little bit explore or explanation about the impact of the tsunami on mental disorders, and what do you suggest to psychiatrists? Because as far as I know, the impact of tsunamis on mental health is profound, as these natural disasters cause widespread destruction, loss of life, displacement, and trauma. Survivors often experience a range of psychiatric disorders, both immediately and long term. So, could you please explore or explanation the impact of the tsunami on mental disorders, and what do you suggest to psychiatry? Thank you for your attention.
Terima kasih Pak Wadi. Baik-baik kita bisa ketemu walaupun sepertinya hantu di Zoom itu. Good to see you. No, I think our own work showed, number one, that mental health problems increased enormously during tsunami, during conflict, and that mental health needs to be absolutely central to response, and that any response needs to include not just peer groups, not just nursing groups, etc., but of psychiatrists. And psychiatrists should be among the first to be on hand in any major disaster areas. And I believe that there needs to be more real training of specialists who in psychiatry who are prepared to go to disaster settings. I know this is one specialty, but for those of you who choose to do this kind of work, being able to go quickly and help establish a mental health response using local resources is extremely, extremely important. And I think, that psychiatry needs to have something like a special pusat for disaster and for humanitarian responses. And that's a very central part of community psychiatry. Thank you, Prof. Wadi.
Okay, from what we can conclude from the answer of Prof. Byron is that mental health problems might arise from the tsunamis and conflicts. Also, this triggers lots of response, and psychiatrists also those that needs to on hands or being attend to these particular problems. But in order, before they actually came to the site, they need to receive special training, and in order to do that, they also have they have the need to establish mental health support using available also local resources. Maybe it's that can conclude the answer of Prof. Baron. Okay, next we're moving on to questions and discussions. Is there anybody here who would like to ask Prof. Byron directly?
Ya, boleh,
Okay.
boleh.
Whether it is in Bahasa Indonesia or you can also ask to Prof. Byron directly in English.
Malah aku coba takon iya ta ya. Iki jenenge kejam.
Okay. Dr. Mahar would like to. Okay, monggo.
Terima kasih. Yeah, thank you, Pak Byron. Yeah. Because Pak Byron have been working here since 1996, so it is very long time. I think around 30 years, is it right? Yeah.
Right.
And
Almost
because
30
of that, I am sure that you know everything about mental health service in Indonesia. including collaboration and coordination between or interministry. Yeah. And my questions would be how to increase the quality of coordinations and collaboration interministry in Indonesia. And I will give you an example from the COVID-19 pandemic. At the time, I think you ever heard that once around 60 until 70 people died in Sarjito Hospital because of the lack of oxygen. Yeah, and since the year 2004, there were some disasters happen in Indonesia from Aceh and then Jogja in Padang and so on. But it seems to me that we never get lesson learned from many disasters. I remember when in around 2006, yeah, after earthquake in Yogyakarta, at the time we have a meeting, and you asked me why in Jogja still have many meetings, and so we lack of intervention to the survivor. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, we know that Indonesia, of course, has many disasters between earthquakes. You know, we are not in a period like at the end of the Suharto era when there was a lot of military conflict. But we still have a lot of military conflict in Papua. There is still a very large need for mental health response in Papua. And I do not hear very much talk about it. And, you know, so I think that, so there are two very different issues. One, what can psychiatrists do? And I do think that psychiatrists really organizing around response to disaster is important. I actually have not asked recently, you know, who all is involved in, you know, where are the most important centers, whether Jogja or UI or where are the most important centers for disaster psychiatry. But I think there needs to be that psychiatry needs to be well organized as to training young people to go and respond and know what kind of response to develop. So that's one issue. The issue of lack of coordination has been true for at least all the 30 years that I've lived here, and it hasn't really changed. That is, as long as psychiatric hospitals are in one place, Puskesmas, mental health is in another place, rehab is in another place, Kader Desa is under another ministry. Often I've heard people in the ministry in Jakarta say, oh, we solved this problem because we have an MOU between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Social Affairs, between Menkes and Mensos. We have all solved this problem. No, you haven't solved the problem. If you go, there was a recent effort to develop a kind of model program in Manado. It was a total failure because it was not prepared for, and the Dinsos Provinsi was not interested. They hadn't asked for this. So I can just say that this remains a very large issue for Indonesia, that it also remains in the United States, I would say. And so the United States is not a model to follow. Australia has much better organized mental health system that begins with communities and is coordinated directly to the hospital system. And I think, I would just say, many of you know more about this than I do, but I would just say, watching for 30 years, the problem hasn't been solved. And there is no, maybe mental health needs to move into coordinating ministry or someplace. I don't know how to deal with this. Because for me, you guys in this room need to be organizing, quote, rehab. Not often, Dinsos often says, yes, we do rehab, but physical rehab, we actually don't know anything about mental health. That's not true of all Dinsos, and they get involved in some places, but whether we need to use a different word than rehab or what, but to actually, so let me just say one of the most encouraging things that we learned, I would say in the last 50 years, about severe mental illness. If you follow people, if you treat people with psychosis, and you follow them for 5 years, you can be quite pessimistic about people recovering. However, if you follow people for 10 years or 20 years, you find that most people recover. 2/3 of people recover. And I often say to people, if you believe that people never get better, then what kind of mental health system do you want? But what if you actually believe that people can recover and that you can help them recover much faster? Then what kind of mental health system do you need? And obviously, medication isn't the only thing. People need to be able to go back to work. In agricultural communities, it's actually easier than in industrial communities because people can start working part-time easily. But the difficulty in rural areas is people often have no medication. And we know that the outreach of mental health systems into rural areas is still quite limited. So I think that I think that internalizing the idea that with the most severe cases, over time, with help, people will recover. 2/3 of people, not all. Important. That 2/3 of people over time will recover. And in the baseline survey, Bukarla, that we did, that Budiola was involved in, we found people who had been ill for like 20 years, who had already had a diagnosis for more than 20 years. Many of them still carried the label mentally ill, but most of them were already really largely recovered. They were working. They had kids. They had choo-choo. So that it's important that we actually think we're actually treating illnesses that people recover from. Now that's true in a disaster setting also, that untreated PTSD can last for many years. Treated PTSD, people get better. They really get better. And I have to say, anthropologists don't very often have the chance to work in projects. So, saya kira semuanya sudah tahu. Saya bukan dokter, ya. Saya antropolog. Tapi saya kerja dalam psikiatri sejak tahun berapa itu tahun 76. My first job was in psychiatry in 1976, before any of you were born, in a center that was developing community mental health care for all of California at that time. And so, I have watched the evolution of this, and anthropologists usually like go and do these kinds of research, but personally for me, there were two impacts of working in Aceh. One was to actually say human beings really do terrible things to each other. And I was really, in a way, shocked by the level of the stories that I heard. And that says you have to take seriously human beings have the potential to do really bad things to each other, to torture each other. But the other thing was, as an anthropologist, to be able to organize a program and watch people get better was an astonishing experience for me. We would go and I remember going and talking to one woman, and we were with Hayat, the Hayatullah. He is one of our nurses who is trained very well in trauma treatment. And I remember we went in to see this one woman, and she was just sitting there looking very depressed. She looked up and looked at Hayat, and she said, "You remind me of my son." And then she told us the story of the day she watched her son be tortured and killed. And 1 year later, after her being in treatment, we went to see her, and she was no longer in the house. She was out working, doing some agricultural work there in front of her house of harvesting. And she looked up at us and smiled and said, "I remember you. You still remind me of my son, but I don't need to talk about that anymore." So that her experience of illness had gone from being very present to being put in the past. So I think, one of the most encouraging things for us is to know that with mental health care, people can get better. We often forget about this. And partly, psychiatrists are famous for not thinking people get better, because the people who get better don't come back to see you. The people who get better don't come back. You don't often use them. Many times you never see the ones that get better. You only see the ones that stay sick. But if you actually get to look more broadly, people get better. I went to one place with Bukarla early on. Mas siapa namanya? And you saw him, he was working in a construction work. 6 months earlier, he had been very psychotic. And I remember you went and you said, "Is this you?" Because he had basically recovered. Anyhow, I just think that it's important to maintain. So we need systems that enable you to do your work, to help people get better. And I just, to me, the tragedy is that we know people can get better much faster. And we need to invest in mental health systems that make that happen.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Baran, for the answer. So, based upon your 30 years experience in Indonesia, there are lots of different ministries and policies towards handling the problems of the mental health problems. Also, the problem still remains in Indonesia, but also not only in Indonesia, but also in United States. Meanwhile, the Australia is better organized with their systems, which starts from community and coordinate directly with the hospitals. Also, for the rehabilitation problems, also it's also a wake-up call for us, so that we need to emphasize more on this approach on how to make the living experience of those with mental health problems can also be productive, and also how to address the stigma still really happen around them. Okay, barangkali Bu Carla mau.
I just want to share my experience when I was in Boston, Pak Byron, sewaktu saya di Boston, there was a demonstration, ada demonstrasi, ada spanduk tulisannya begini, psychiatry is pseudoscience, psikiatri itu adalah ilmu ilmiah palsu, they make illness for profit, bikin penyakit hanya untuk dapat uang. Dan itu benar-benar membuat saya, apa iya ya? Jangan-jangan iya. Tapi itu membuat saya berpikir bahwa stigma atau stigmatization for psychiatry is very huge until now. Jadi bagaimana kita bisa memerangi itu? Mungkin salah satunya pertanyaan saya untuk Pak Byron. I know you have met Pak Menteri Kesehatan ya Pak Byron, Pak Budi Gunadi Sadikin. And I don't know what is your discussion with him regarding mental health, Pak Byron. If you have any suggestion to start for mental health, what will your suggestion for him? Because I know that many of his policy for me is not very friendly for us psychiatrists and for policy for mental health. What do you think, Pak Byron?
So first, it is true that there is globally, including in Boston, as you said, an anti-psychiatry movement that can be often very powerful, and that some persons label themselves as survivors. They use that term in English, of survivors of mental health care. And, you know, I know some of the people who actually are very opposed to the use of medication. And actually, I do think that you can practice psychiatry with much less medication if you have proper social support and care. I think giving people the proper kind of support, keeping them out of hospitals, is one way to destigmatize people. Bukarlan knows we often worked with a group in Melbourne, in Uni Melbourne. Pat McGorry is a great leader in the field of early intervention, and believes that if you have that one of the worst things that can happen is to take someone who is 18 years old, is having a first psychotic episode, and simply put them in a room has 40-year-old, 50-year-old, 60-year-old people who are psychotic, and they begin to feel that that's what my life is going to become. And that they themselves very early on begin to feel hopeless, and their families begin to feel hopeless. And so, you know, I think having early psychosis settings in which young people who first have illness should be receiving care among other young people. I think, and you know, Carla and I and Diola and many people in this group have long dreamed about creating that as a kind of model for early intervention. And one of the things that Pat McGorry knows, I don't know today how this is in Jogja, in many parts of the world, so there are very high rates of use of one or another kind of narcoba, of simply, for instance, marijuana. It's now legal in Massachusetts for young people, for people over 20 years old, 21 years old, to buy marijuana. There are stores. And the good thing is that people aren't put in jail for selling a little bit of marijuana. which was often done mostly to black people. But the danger is, certainly, Pat McGorry would say over and over again that if you're having a psychotic episode and you're young, any kind of use of drugs is very dangerous. Any kind of use of marijuana is dangerous. Any kind of use of alcohol is actually dangerous when you are having a first episode. And so young people need special kinds of education, and they need to be dressed in their usual clothing. They need to be in a place in which they are not wearing clothing that stigmatizes them. And they need to, but on the other hand, medications can often be extremely helpful in the very early stages also. So, you know, I'm very committed myself personally to having, you know, medical care become available to people early on, and for us to develop less stigmatizing ways of developing, of providing care. The second thing is, you know, I would love to interview more of you, but I think actually that since COVID, psychiatry has become less stigmatized, and especially psychiatry that focuses on problems of isolation, of addiction to social media and hape, etc. That is, there are lots of areas that is far less stigmatized today than it was 20 years ago. So I think that's actually an encouragement. And the number of applicants for residency in psychiatry has changed very dramatically in the last 30 years, right, Carla? Yeah. So there is, I knew many people, I knew psychiatrists who, when they went into psychiatry and they told their parents were terribly upset. And their parents would never tell their friends that my kid is becoming a psychiatrist. Never. You.
My mother would be
Yeah. So some of you have had that experience, but I think things are quite different now. I also think that, you know, Pap Budi is not a doctor. He really doesn't understand that much about many areas, but he also gets people around him. I think he organized the response to COVID much better than maybe many of the physicians would have, because he knew how to do international, you know, to work at an international level, to get loans, to get drugs brought in, to get testing really up and going. And, you know, I think in that way, he always talked about himself as being someone who is like a banker. You should be able to get health care, like even in the village, you have anywhere very small town, there's an ATM. You should be able to get health care like you get an ATM. It should be there it should be not so far from people and so hard to get. So he believes in that, and he believes in primary care, and he believes in outreach. And what I would say is that he needs to continue to be educated about psychiatry. He needs to understand. He needs to be supportive of the fact that there are more psychiatrists today. And I think, you know, whatever, the omnibus bill increased the number of specialists being trained in Indonesia, or it's on the way to doing that. I think that in some ways is good. And I would say Bu Nova Orianti Yusuf, who organized the bill on mental health, she said, which is better, to have a bill that was never implemented, or to have someone who actually wants to find new ways to implement mental health care? So I think and so I haven't had a discussion yet with most of the people in Jakarta about the new rule about hospitals. I'm still trying to find out what that was all about and how they really envision that, because I think it's a big problem myself. But I still think that, so, I think I would just say Pak Budi has already come a long ways in being more committed to mental health than he was 5 years ago. He came on so I first interacted with your minister of health when the students at Harvard organized for him to do a Zoom call and give a talk at Harvard. And I was also in Indonesia at this time, and they asked me to introduce him. So I learned about him and introduced him. And I also told them about my interest in mental health care. And he gave his talk without one word of mental health. And so I asked him, the first question I said, can I ask you about your policy on mental health care? And he said, I really don't know much about mental health. And he was like open about that. And he said, I've been to a few hospitals, and I actually think people are better treated at home than in hospitals. And I also feel, he said, that, we need to work on early intervention and prevention, because if people start off with depression, later, if you don't treat it, it becomes something like schizophrenia. So I had to tell him, let's talk later, but you actually need to learn more. You're interested in genetics. The genetic differences between different kinds of diseases, you do not start with depression and develop psychosis. So this is a personal kind of comment about him. I sent him a note about this, and he wrote back the next morning by WhatsApp and said, come and see me and bring a team to begin to teach me about mental health. So this is a person who actually does care. And I don't know, under the current pressures that the president of trying to reduce budget deficit, etc., I don't know which directions, how much that influences the new policies about psychiatric hospitals. So I'm I'm still finding out what's going on. I'm off to Jakarta again next week to talk to some more people and see what I can learn about it. But I would just say, we need to educate the policymakers. We need to have very good lobbying that isn't just seem to be just in lobbying by psychiatrists for psychiatrists. No, there need to be links between the peer groups, between, between the family groups. All of the online support groups now need to be coordinated to actually work along with psychiatry to lobby on behalf of improving mental health services.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Byron, for the answer. So, from what I conclude here is Prof. Byron is truly emphasizing on early intervention, also fighting the stigma that is still around those, whether it is the patients or for us, the professional healthcare professional of mental health care. Also, may I conclude the three major take-home message from the presentation of Professor Byron. First, the mental health needs are long-term, which from the case study in Aceh, trauma-related conditions persist long after disaster and conflicts, also requiring sustained intervention and support. And then community-based mental health care is effective, but it also needs support, such like mobile clinics, local mental health workers, also to utilize the local values, wisdoms, also resources. And there are a dire need to collaboration and research to drive the sustainable solutions. For examples like partnerships between universities, governments, and also NGOs, along with data-driven approaches, so that we can ensure the effective and lasting mental health problems. Okay, thank you, Professor Byrons, for the presentation and also discussions. Please give a major applause for our esteemed speaker today, Professor Byron J. Good. Thank you, Prof. Baik, sekarang tugas saya memoderatori sudah selesai, maka saya bisa berdiri lagi, jadi MC lagi. Telah kita saksikan presentasi dan juga diskusi dari Profesor Byron Goods yang sangat luar biasa, dan ambil case study beliau di Aceh dan bagaimana itu ternyata menyentuh beragam aspek, dan terutama pendekatan dari community mental health. Dan juga pada akhir diskusi tadi Prof. Byron menekankan pentingnya untuk early intervention serta memerangi stigma yang ada tidak hanya pada pasien kita, tapi ternyata juga pada diri kita sebagai pelaku kesehatan jiwa profesional. Barangkali itu yang bisa saya sampaikan. Saya Bayu, saya belum perkenalan tadi ternyata. Ya, ini menjadi MC dan juga moderator. Mudah-mudahan apa yang didiskusikan dan disampaikan oleh Prof. Byron tadi, kita bisa mengambil manfaat daripadanya. Saya juga mohon maaf apabila ada kekurangan dan kesalahan pada kesempatan ini. Mudah-mudahan kita dapat mengoptimalkan keilmuan yang telah kita dapatkan hari ini dalam hidup kita, terutama hidup profesional kita sebagai psychiatrist, also future psychiatrist. Oke, barangkali itu dari saya. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, shalom, om, santi, santi, om, namo buddhaya, salam kebajikan, dumugi tansah pinaringan rahayu.